All right. Woo, that is loud. So I know that you all can hear me. So if you can please start making your way up to the front. So all of those in the back, once again, make your way to the front, and we are about to get started. And I know the question that you all have been wondering is, what is the Wi-Fi password? So I have it for you. And that is capital B, capital C, capital S 22. So if you all have questions about that, feel free to come grab me afterwards and I will share. But with that, my name is Lori Harder. I am the manager of social impact at Alteryx, and I am also on the summit committee. Thank you all for joining us today for Politics Meet CSR, 8 tips on how and when to respond, with Rich Maori, president of Rocket Social Impact. Rich is the CEO of Rocket Social Impact, a national corporate social responsibility and communication agency. He is recognized social impact leader, having worked the past 25 years working with companies from Fortune 100 to startups to achieve better business and greater goods through CSR and ESG. His past work includes 12 years at Cone Communications, where he led Cone's award-winning work with brands such as Target, CVS, Patagonia, T-Mobile, and Disney. He founded Rocket in 2018 to support clients through all phases of their ESG and CSR work, strategy development, implementation, communication, and measurement. The agency was recently recognized as the best purpose agency by Boston Business Magazine. Rich is also an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University, teaching a course on philanthropy. He holds his MA in public policy from Boston College and a BA in justice and law from America University. Rich is going to share with us today how companies are responding to political efforts through their CSR or how corporate social responsibility efforts, and then also how you all can make decision-making tree to quickly assess how your company should respond to these efforts. As a reminder, all of these workshops are being recorded and the resources mentioned will be available after the summit. We will save time at the end of these presentations to address any questions. And for those of you that are virtual, we encourage you to send your comments and your thoughts in the portal. So also don't forget to share what you all have learned by tagging BCivic and share on social media. So with that, I am honored to present Rich.
How about now? Ooh, there you can. Wow. Okay. Good morning. We're going to talk about politics and CSR, which for some clients is as much fun as talking about measurement in CSR. It's just one of those issues that you're going to get dragged into rather than you really want to be dealing with. Real quick about us, all we do is CSR, so we're kind of CSR nerds. And the reason I flag this is we are constantly looking at what companies are doing, industries are doing when it comes to different topics. And increasingly, unfortunately, this has become a topic that is affecting all companies, big and small. So the last 4 years, I think goes without saying, it has changed the world. It has certainly changed us personally, but it has also changed our profession. 4 years ago, I was 6'2" with a nice full head of hair. It has beaten us down in terms of what's going on and how it affects what we do every day, be it CSR, ESG, DE&I, HR. So one of those issues is that intersection of CSR and politics. It's unfortunate that this is increasingly coming up more and more because in many ways it takes companies off the ball, where they're having to kind of play whack-a-mole. An issue pops up, everyone rushes, we fix that. 2 weeks later, something else happens. What are we going to do about that? So what I hope to do today is give you some insights of how some companies have been able to handle it. Have you leave here a bit empowered, a bit inspired. We can deal with this. At the end of the day, there is not a magic bullet. I wish there were. There are some frameworks, some guiding ways you can think about this. At the end of the day, it is judgment calls that companies have to make. And you have to understand that you're not going to get it right in terms of you will piss off some folks. And it's really just a matter of who we're going to piss off and to what degree, and are we comfortable with that? So I'm going to go quickly here because this generally evokes a lot of questions, and that's a good thing. But certainly hold your questions to the end and we can get to them. So I mentioned expectations are rising. We expect these numbers will tick up, but you see pretty compelling numbers that they want you to take action. They, being your stakeholders, be it employees, consumers, even your supply partners, and increasingly your board and investors are expect you to have a point of view. They want you to have a point of view, and they will reward you if you have a point of view, depending on, again, what side of the issue you fall on. So we expect these numbers will only continue to tick up, certainly as you think of the millennials and Gen Zs, who pay attention to this stuff much more than the Gen Xers and the boomers. It's also an issue of greater CEO accountability. Your leaders are expected to have a point of view. Someone puts a microphone in their face and says, what do you think about what's going on in Iran? And they have to have a point of view. Maybe not on that one, but you get where I'm going. What's your point of view about Roe versus Wade? What is your point of view about the immigration bills? Increasingly, CEOs have to have a point of view on that. That is not something they're comfortable with, the majority of them. And so they're having to kind of get comfortable with this. And guess what? That trickles down to you all, making sure they're comfortable in thinking about this. You have empowered stakeholders. There's a great democracy to communication these days because we all have a phone. Most of us have a pretty social media platforms, and we have no problem getting that word out. Increasingly, your stakeholders, i.e. employees and consumers, have no problem raising issues about what you're doing as a company, be it with your CSR, ESG efforts, and they push it out through social media, and they have a greater voice. So these folks are fired up, and the key is how are you going to manage and work with them to make sure you understand kind of what they're saying, what you're hearing, and then what you're saying back to them. So the fun part of operating in this new reality is you're constantly, as I mentioned, you only have so much time in a day. You only have so many hours in a day. You only have so much of a budget. You only have so many people. You cannot respond to every single issue. The challenge is there are folks who expect you to, your employees, the stakeholders. And how do you message that? How do you decide what issues we respond to? What issues do we support? And what issues are we going to just stay silent because it doesn't affect us? And then you have to mitigate the backlash. You will get backlash. You have to have a thick skin in this game. And being ready for that and having the discipline to stick to your guns on that. So what I'll share with you is what we've seen work and not work, and kind of maybe even in between, in terms of how companies have tried to deal with all the variety of issues coming at you. And I'm talking about everything from election integrity, January 6th, immigration, Ukraine, abortion, and then you go to that's only at the national and global level. Then you go to the state level. Don't say gay law. This is all coming at you and companies, and you need some type of framework to figure out when do we say yes, when do we say no, and when do we kind of get in there. This beautiful slide here kind of shows you we're operating on a high risk, high reward basis now. Done right, you can solidify, even grow your relationships with your key stakeholders. And that leads to greater business and greater good. Done wrong, and I'll show you some examples of done wrong, you kind of effed up all the work you've been doing on the CSR side, and you've effed up the company's reputation. And for some companies, that shows up in stock prices. That shows up in losing investors. So there is high risk and a high reward. So you're constantly, unfortunately, doing this balancing act. And one of my clients says, that is me on a weekly basis. Different issues popping up, certainly if you're a global company, different issues popping up. What's the process for figuring this out? Step one, and this isn't rocket science here, but it certainly takes discipline. It takes getting the right folks in the room. But you start asking yourself a series of questions. Is this relevant to our business? What are our stakeholders going to think? And you have 4 or 5 stakeholders. Now you've got to figure out how to prioritize those. Because In my experience, not all of them will agree. Do we have credibility to speak on this issue? And then finally, if we do this issue, do we actually going to drive impact? My favorite was after George Floyd death, companies putting on LinkedIn, "We stand against racism." Good for you. You get a cookie. What were you actually doing about it? What's the impact you're hoping to achieve besides putting out a statement? Because back to the communicating empowered stakeholder, they have no problem going on social media and calling bullshit on you now. And we're seeing that more and more. We're seeing employees walk out of their own building to protest their employer. That didn't happen 5 years ago. So let's start with the first question you ask yourself. So issue pops up. Let's talk about the shelters, the immigration shelters on the southwest border, pardon me. That pops up. Is that an issue that aligns, is it in conflict with our corporate values? Does it kind of hit us in the moral compass of that we can, as a company, not personally, and this is where I think a lot of companies make mistakes, is CEO says, "I'm against this." They're against it personally, but we need you to take out the passion. We need you to take out what your personal preferences are. We need you to take out the emotion and think very cold and calculating. Does this impact our business? Does this impact our industry? Is it linked, to any of our geographic areas? Again, you're a global company, maybe. You're a Denver-based company. What's going on in Florida doesn't affect you. You get a pass. If you're a Denver-based company, but you have an office in Orlando, you've got to potentially have to weigh in. And then ultimately, does it align with our CSR and ESG strategy? If you have a program about helping empower and educate young immigrants, you should have a point of view on this. And if you don't, again, folks are going to call you out on it. So these are the first 4 questions you should be asking yourself. And in that room should be leadership. In that room should be your communications team, potentially your HR team. And increasingly in that room is someone from a employee resource group or a BRG, business resource group. Simply because, based on the issue, simply because they tend to be a focus group of 1 or 2. What I've seen is the leadership comes up with an idea and then turns to that person and goes, will this work for you? Not ideal. You should be doing that ahead of time, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So 4 questions that you have going on as we talk about the immigration issue and the shelters on the southwest border. Changing gears real quickly. So Nike had this very issue. Colin Kaepernick takes a knee in protest of police violence. We all know what happens. Half the country says yes, great for you. Half the country says you're unpatriotic, how dare you. Start burning Nike products, videotaping that. It goes online, it's everywhere. Nike's freaking out, stocks going down, investors are wondering, employees on the other side are saying, why aren't we doing more? And so Nike asked themselves those 4 questions. They really only got to the first question. They said, does this align with our values? What he's doing is true to our moral compass as a company. And then they did talk to employees, and they did talk to business partners. And the expectation was that Nike would have a point of view on this and stand behind him. And they did. And they got their asses handed to them for about 2 or 3 weeks. And then those folks, those stakeholders started rallying to the cause, to the company. And the company held firm. We believe in him. They even did an ad campaign supporting him, did donations supporting a variety of causes that moved this issue forward. And they came out of it in actually a better place. Now, I know it's an easy one because Nike has such a legacy there, and we'll talk about the credibility, but they also had the credibility to be able to stand behind him. So that, they decided, works for them, their business. This one, maybe not. Pizza Inn, if you're not familiar, is a Texas-based pizza chain. Shortly after the 2020 election, CEO goes online, not really telling anyone, starts putting out a variety of unsolicited ideas in terms of election integrity. Not exactly what folks are looking for from the CEO of a pizza company. They had no credibility in the space. It didn't affect their industry, didn't affect their business, didn't affect their stakeholders. But they decided to weigh in anyway. Again, I think they got a little personal, a little passionate, and a little emotional. And they ended up with a problem on their hands. Because this one throws some media, and the feedback through social media, and even in the company was, what the hell are we doing? We have no business, no reason to be getting in, sticking our nose in this. He did it on January 5th as well. So the only thing that saved him further, potentially from getting fired, was January 6th happened, and all the media attention kind of sucked up all the air in the space. So a cautionary tale of, A, don't let your CEO have a social media account and use it without some adult supervision. But second was, again, this did not fit with anything they were doing as a company, values, audience, nothing like that. So that's the first grounding set of questions. Second grounding set of questions, and this one's tough, I get it. What are our stakeholders going to think? What are employees going to think? Clients, suppliers, investors, board, all of them. And as I mentioned earlier, it's rare that A, you know ahead of time, and B, that they're all going to agree. So then you got to choose your favorite children. Like, how are we going to prioritize these folks? Because inevitably you're going to piss them off, someone. They're going to be disappointed in the stance you take. Again, risk reward. So what we've seen happen more and more, and let's talk about Disney real quick. And if you follow this, they knew that Don't Say Gay law was coming. They knew it. They were working, quote unquote, behind the scenes to try to minimize it. Problem is the employees didn't know that. The law really starts to accelerate, get some momentum, starts to look like it's going to happen. Now Disney's got a problem because not all, the majority of their employees were saying, what are we doing about this? This is against our values. This is not the kind of company I want to work for. Now you're Disney, you're like, sweet Moses, what am I going to do? You know, they face several risks on both sides. So I mentioned the employee piece. You had guests who were weighing in on one side or the other, but they also faced some serious business issues. They had a pretty sweet tax deal that the governor was threatening to take away. They had guests on the other side of the issue who were threatening to boycott. And so they tried to do the middle, and at the end of the day, they failed trying to do the middle. They kind of pissed both sides off. They pissed the employees off because they weren't really engaged to begin with. And it was only a bit of a mea culpa that they landed on the position of, we are against this bill. If they'd done that at the beginning, they could have saved themselves a lot of heartache, a lot of time. And again, you don't have a lot of those things. They're in short supply, time, budget, people. This is one of my favorite. Wayfair, if you're not familiar, during the immigration crisis, the company sold about $200,000 worth of mattresses to a government procurement company that provided those mattresses to the immigration homeless shelters. The immigration shelters, again, on the southwest border. The employees found out about this, wrote a letter to leadership saying, please don't do this. It doesn't align with our values. We don't want to be seen supporting this, and we certainly don't want to be profiting off it as a company. And leadership said, nah, I hear you, we're still going to do it. Roughly 1,000 employees walked out of the building shortly after. This isn't a Wayfair employee holding up a sign, calling out his own employer. Again, probably wouldn't have happened a handful of years ago. It is happening more and more. So guess what was on the news? Great pictures of 1,000 Wayfair employees standing outside of the building, holding signs, chanting at their employer. Not a good look for Wayfair. And so over a $200,000 sale, they did demonstrable damage to their reputation internally and externally. And one thing they didn't do was talk to their employees, really listen to their employees. They got the letter, they met, they said, we're going to move it forward. They didn't understand the passion and the commitment their employees really felt around this issue. And they could have done that simply by some listening, and we'll talk about different ways of doing that. So listen, right? What do they want? What do they expect? What do you think a board member will think of? What do you think your investors will think of? Do we have the credibility to speak out? Have we been supporting this issue or not? Do we have a track record of supporting causes in this space? Do our past actions and statements kind of align with what our position would be now? Patagonia, simple one, right? The company was kind of founded with an environmental ethos. And they have a long legacy of getting it. Not all companies could put this on their clothing. They received a lot of attention, but the feedback was, that's Patagonia. They've been talking about this for decades. So this is only, actually, the next step in them kind of pushing a stronger environmental agenda for the country and the globe. Kendall Jenner, for all her talents, and I'm sorry, I don't know what she does, but Pepsi decided she'd be a great person to help talk about racial justice. Here's the problem. Kendall Jenner had no background or anything about speaking about racial justice. And unfortunately, the company didn't really either. Well, Pepsi decided this would be a good idea following the George Floyd protests and following racial justice protests and Black Lives Matter protests, that they would do an ad showing Kendall Jenner kind of providing a Pepsi to a police officer during a simulated protest. Oy. They got their asses handed to them. They had no real credibility. You could even go back to the first question. Does this really affect our business and industry? They thought because the issue was really touching upon millennials and Gen Zs, that they thought they had some reason to get in there because it was the right thing for the business because of the consumer. They didn't talk to employees, they didn't talk to suppliers, they didn't talk to anybody. And then they show up with this, and they have no track record of talking about or doing much around racial justice. And even worse, then they find a celebrity who has no track record in this. This is what's it come off as? It comes off as BS. It comes off as greenwashing, or in this case, CSR washing. And then back to the empowered stakeholder. They lit up Twitter. My favorite was, who knew that the civil rights movement could be solved with a Pepsi, right? This is not what you want if you're the Pepsi brand manager. And why it pisses me off a bit is this makes all of us kind of look bad. This starts to cheapen what we do. We're about impact and better business and greater good. This is slick marketing and using a social issue, a contentious one at that, to try to make yourself look better with no track record of doing it, no real alignment with your business, and clearly being a bit tone deaf when it comes to your consumer and employees. So I beat up on Pepsi. I don't mean to, but this one certainly annoyed me. Starbucks, they do CSR and ESG quite well. They're generally held up as a kind of gold standard. Even they messed it up. So following deaths in Ferguson, Missouri, and the protests there, they decided, it'd be a good idea to have your barista talk to you about kind of race. I'm sure it sounded like a good idea in the room. They're not dummies over there. You're getting coffee this morning. Do you want to talk to me about race? Did you? And? They said no. I don't want to, right? They didn't really talk to their employees. They really didn't have much credibility of talking about this because that's not what you're there for. Again, it came off kind of slick, It came off as markety. There was no real impact, aside from you and I talking about this. Not that we're going to solve, systemic racism over a latte. And it seems silly. And Starbucks got their ass handed to them. And what I mean by that is their employees raised up, their franchisees rised up, their stock went down. These are big deals now. When your stock goes down, that tends to get everyone's attention. So again, another cautionary tale of a company who thought they had it figured out, but didn't do the basic things of, does this align with our business? Are we listening to our stakeholders? Do we have credibility to enter this space in a meaningful and real way? And the last question you're going to ask yourself, and this is all in the same meeting, right? Does it impact our business? And you're going to need more than 30 minutes for this meeting that you're going to be having. Does it impact our business? What do our stakeholders think? Do we have credibility to move? And then if we do move, what kind of impact are we going to have? Back to companies putting out, we stand against racism posts on LinkedIn. Good for you. What are you actually doing about it? We went through and looked at half of those statements. We looked at all those statements. What we found is 60% of those companies did not make a donation to any racial justice movement efforts or organizations at all. They simply put up a post that said we're against racism. Now again, we're CSR nerds, so we're looking for this stuff. I will tell you in 1 to 2 years, consumers or employees will start calling out more and more for that stuff. There's a disconnect between your actions and your words. So can we actually make an impact? And what would that impact be? And what do we bring into the table that's somewhat different besides potentially money? Citigroup looked at the violence, the gun violence that was happening. And this was actually in 2018. And decided, we're going to take a stand and we actually have ability to make some impact. But they asked themselves the 4 questions. Does this impact our industry? And they believe it did. What will our stakeholders think? They decided it was 50-50. Half of our employees will like it, half won't. Some of our business clients will cheer us, some of our business clients won't. But they instituted a policy saying, if you're going to do business with us and you're going to be selling at the retail level, we want you to hear some best practices. Now, we can debate whether or not these have any teeth to them, these practices, and will they actually mitigate gun violence. But this is something they did. And they felt we have a unique role in doing this. Given what we do, we can monitor this, we can cut people off if needed in terms of sellers who aren't adhering to this policy. And it continues today, and they've asked other financial institutes to do the same thing. So that was kind of their unique superpower when it came to this issue. And not all of us have that luxury, but they figured out a way they could play very specifically around a pretty controversial issue. Yes, they got a lot of negativity, certainly from the NRA and others saying, why are you taking a position? They said, we feel a moral reason to take this position. And we feel it's important to our business, and we feel it's important to our stakeholders, and we believe we have not just the credibility, but we have an ability to have a real impact. Good for them. Our friends at Gillette kind of missed it. During the Me Too movement, they created a campaign series, and you may have seen it, talking about toxic masculinity. And Gillette's known for helping men be the best they can be in all sorts of facets. And they thought that this was in that facet, helping men better understand and address toxic masculinity. And again, the goal was to promote discussion. Let's talk about this and what toxic masculinity looks like, certainly is in younger men and boys. Problem was they didn't really have any, they didn't offer a solution aside from let's talk about it. There was nothing they did. They didn't make a series of policies. They didn't make a series of donations. They didn't try to pull others together to convene discussion around this issue with very specific steps. They put out an ad that was somewhat controversial, promoted it, they got behind it, and then they got their asses handed to them as well. There was no way for consumers to engage. So Gillette believed it was in their business, because again, they're helping men be the best they can be. They thought this would be important to stakeholders. They thought they had the credibility to do it. Where they flubbed is at the end here. They had no idea of what they were trying to accomplish, aside from burnish their reputation by aligning with a cause that they thought was important to their stakeholders. There was nothing here. I don't know if you saw the ad, but it was controversial. The ad got praise from some, but a lot of folks are kind of where's the beef, if you will? Where's the impact? What are you asking us to do? So another cautionary tale of they checked the box on the first three and they flubbed the fourth. And so unless you're going to get all four right, you still get a call from the CEO saying, what are we going to do here? They ended up pulling the ad, apologizing, just like Pizza Inn did, just like Pepsi did, just like Starbucks did. Simply going through those four questions would have helped them immeasurably to avoid this kind of disaster. So let's go through this. You meet, got the right folks in the room, you've identified 7 or 8 issues that you're like, geez, we need to respond to these issues. Here's the trouble, not all issues are created equally. I mentioned Iran the other day because we've had 2 or 3 clients who are global calls and say, should we be taking a position on what's going in the protests in Iran? Well, guys, remember what we taught you. It's important to your business. Not really. What about your stakeholders? Well, we have some employees from the Middle East, but they're asking us what we're doing, but we're not. Do we have any credibility here? And can we make a measurable impact? And the answer was clearly no. So they did not take a position on it. That's an extreme example. Immigration, abortion gets much fuzzier and harder. But let's assume you've identified, say, 6 or 7 issues that you're like, these are the ones I'm going to get behind. But you got to prioritize those issues. Again, you don't have enough hours in the day, enough budget, and enough bandwidth to respond to all these things. And if you do, this is all reactive. That means you're probably not doing your job on the CSR side, which you're already busy enough trying to do. And then this hand grenade falls in your lap. So we identify the issues, and then we got to prioritize these issues. And again, not rocket science. The companies that are disciplined, very cold and calculating, tend to do this quite well in terms of managing a crisis or managing a proactive initiation around a controversial social topic. So first we want to do this. What are your priority issues? So Coke made LGBTQ as one of their priority issues. There are other issues they support: climate change, immigration. But these are 2 or 3 issues that you're going to get behind, and you are going to, like Nike, kind of stand behind. You're going to dedicate the majority of your time, treasure, talent to these issues. These are your issues. So then the question is, all right, these are our issues, our priority issues. How? How are we? So we know what, right? Got the what. These are the issues. Now, how do we get behind these issues? This are all the things in your toolbox, and your toolbox could include others here. You could do some of these, you could do 1 or 2, but whatever you do, it has to be, again, impactful, credible. So you could do everything from raising awareness, but with a specific point of view and with an action tied to it. You could advocate, all the way down the list here. These are things in your toolbox when the communications team or the CEO or HR turns to you and say, okay, we're going to get behind this issue. Now how? You have these tools in your toolbox, and then it's a degree to how much are we going to get behind these and which ones are we actually going to do. Based on our assets, based on our brand, where can we have the most impact using one of these or others that you come up with? So 2 to 3 issues. These are your priority issues. Then you got some supporting issues. These are issues you believe because they're true to your values as a company, or your business or your stakeholders, but not to the degree that the priority issues are. So there's some nuancing here, and this is where it gets a little, I don't want to say complicated, but a little, gray. These are issues where you will show up, but you may not fully get behind legislation. You may not join a coalition. But this is where you're demonstrating your support, highlighting that support to the stakeholders that are important to this issue, your stakeholders, and then providing some sorts of impact, be it monetary, awareness driving, volunteerism, engagement, anything. So I use the Ukraine one because these tend to be these supporting issues, almost like disaster relief in the sense of they're episodic. Of course, you're going to get behind them. But sometimes they kind of move off our radar after that initial moment. So again, you're not going full bore on these issues. You're still supporting them. You're telling your stakeholders you support them. But they're not getting the love and the care and the resources that your priority issues are. So bear with me here, because this gets there's a lot here. There's probably far more copy on a slide than I ever like. But this is a client, we're not going to use their name, but this is their customer and employee profile, primarily skewed younger, their values, their primary workforce locations, and this is important. Why? Because what folks in South Carolina think is almost complete opposite what folks in Silicon Valley think, which presents a challenge for them. And then their CSR priorities, because again, we want to be able to line up the social issue with our CSR priorities. So going through the exercise, we identified all these issues as things they could explore. And we asked them to choose choose your favorite child. Inclusivity, LGBTQ, is something that was highly important to them based on their values, based on their customer and employees, based on their CSR efforts they were already doing. It split the company kind of in half because you had their warehouses in South Carolina and Texas, those folks weren't that keen on it. The folks in Minnesota and Silicon Valley were. Racial justice, people with disabilities came up because, again, they believe in inclusivity. Then you get to that next level of support. We support abortion rights, but it is not a primary tied to our business. It's important to our stakeholders. We really don't have the credibility or we can make much impact aside from some HR policies to really play a priority role. So that's a support role. I mentioned Ukraine, natural disasters. This was what the hardest part was, when they're going to be quiet. The CEO is very active in social causes, sits on a variety of boards, very passionate about gun violence. We had to say to him, you don't have a dog in this fight. It's not tied to your business. Your stakeholders aren't really expecting you to have a role. You have no credibility. And as a manufacturing company, you really can't have any impact based on what you do. So as much as it pains you, you're just going to sit quiet. If there is certainly a gun violence incident, you can send, unfortunately, the thoughts and prayers. You could raise money. You could have your employees do things. But you personally, as a company, aren't going to take a position on this. Same thing with immigration. Same thing with election integrity. And that was a big issue within the company. They're having employees getting into pretty robust arguments on Slack and Yammer. But they decided that, again, going through that process, that didn't align with who they were, what they do, what was expected, and the impact they could have. So think of this as like a quick cheat sheet, but you start with, who are our stakeholders and what's their makeup? What are we all about as a company value-wise? Our geographic location, that's always a curveball. And then our CSR priorities. Because again, if you're about immigration is one of your CSR focus, and you take a stance against it, you're going to get grief. And it's going to, you're essentially building your CSR program with a foundation that has a big old crack in it and eventually will fall. So again, the priority area is where they put a bunch of their time. They do partnerships, they do thought leadership. They talk about these priority issues on their website, in their CSR reports. They talk about the support, almost like a co-star. Your priorities are your stars, your supporting causes are your co-stars. They get some love, but not as much. And then again, there are times where you're just going to be quiet. And it's the discipline of understanding that and communicating that. Here's why. The nice thing about these kind of questions and this type of framework enables you to communicate to employees. They may not agree with you. It enables you to communicate with employees primarily, but also stakeholders. How we got here, why we got here. They need that context. They see you go into a room and an hour later come out and go, this is what we're decided. They need the context and they need some sort of understanding of a framework. Again, not a complicated framework, but the devil's in the details, the devil's in the discussion in terms of figuring that out. Okay, so I've made it doom and gloom for you, but it's not. 4 questions and some sub-questions under there. You've got the right folks in the room. But there's some things you could do before you even get in that room to help mitigate risk. And as we look at companies who've been able to do this, big and small, not just the Patagonias of the world, they do a handful of these things that I'll share with you and do them well. They don't have to do all of them, but there are different ways you can help mitigate risk before you have that meeting. The first thing is staying on top of stakeholder sentiment. This can be easy as bringing in an employee resource group to talk about a controversial issue within the purview of that employee resource group. Increasingly, we're doing kind of adding questions to the annual employee survey, meeting with investors to get their take. Increasingly, this is coming up at board meetings. What's your take on these issues? So the idea is before, not after, the issues happen. I know this isn't easy, but if you can actually just tackle this one piece, you will be in a much better place to act proactively versus reactively. We do a lot of Slack, Yammer, Trickle. You're monitoring those. You're seeing the discussion. One client actually proactively throws out questions like this to get response and start to get a sense of the temperature of employees. Do they expect this? What do they expect the company to do? If they do get behind the issue, what do they expect the company to do? So it's a great tool. You probably already have them. You're probably already doing surveys. Can we add a few questions here to get us a little smarter, get us some data, get us some insights, so we're not scrambling when something happens? So better monitoring of your stakeholders. And that looks different in different companies. What I'm laying out here is different tools that we've seen. All right, so we've got them. Increasingly, we're seeing companies rely, kind of lean on their employee resource groups and business resource groups. For CSR anyway, but we're certainly starting to see them as helpful in helping you, again, gain some insights from your employee base. How could we address this? How could we address racial injustice in a credible, impactful way? And then have that conversation with your BRGs and your ERGs. They sometimes are sitting on some insights that you simply don't have the time because you're running a million miles an hour, sometimes with blinders on. We talk about ERGs and BRGs because they're increasingly becoming way more popular and more empowered. They can be a secret weapon for you. Not just in figuring this out, but say you do take a stand on racial justice. These are your folks who bolster your credibility within the company and externally, outside the company. These are folks who may come to your rescue and say, the company is doing these things, says employee X. We have the right to do this. This is important to us, says employee X. So they can be your best advocates, your best ambassadors, but they need to be brought in on the process. And again, ideally before this becomes an issue, which is why we do kind of the scanning and the monitoring of what are the social issues. Thank you. We talk about enhancing credibility. Increasingly, we do a lot of thought leadership. So obviously, Patagonia has been talking about the environment for a while. There are companies who have been talking about STEM for years, handing out a lot of money. Delta Dental does some amazing work. The key is making sure consumers and employees make that connection between that work and the credibility for them to enter the space. So that starts to look like thought leadership. Are you talking about this consistently? Are you showing up at events? Are you partnering with the right nonprofits? Not just partnering with them, but kind of pushing out a point of view. This is not putting out a press release. This is doing the hard work of showing up at conferences, writing op-eds to burnish, again, your credibility around the priority issues that you've chosen. The nice thing about thought leadership, it gives you a chance to test messages, build relationships. You get in a tight spot, those relationships can come to advocate for you. If at all possible, we try to get clients to pivot. The one client's like, I'm getting beat up from our employees because we're all based in Alabama, Florida, Texas, and Louisiana. And more than half our employees, I think it was 64%, believe the 2020 election was stolen. And we can't get them to focus on anything. And we need to figure out a way to engage with this. So we tried to pivot. It's not about election integrity. We're going to help folks get engaged in the political process by helping folks register. It didn't solve it, it mitigated it. It defanged some of their biggest critics within the company. And they didn't have to wade into the election integrity discussion, they kind of pivoted. So there are ways, if you can, depending on the issue, can you say, hey, we're not going to just we're going to look at the systemic causes of this issue. We're going to try to address those. Harder, I get, but it does allow you to try to get out of this showdown with folks around the specific episodic issue and talk more about what's, the systemic. How did we get here? There is power, and I say safety in numbers. Increasingly, we're seeing companies look to each other. All right, this does affect our company. This does affect our industry. But I don't really want to go out on the ice first and find out it's not thick enough. I don't want to be the one who gets their head bashed in by consumers. But what if we all join together, or some of us join together to provide a point of view? It gives us the credibility. It protects us. We're not the only one out there. So increasingly companies, and you see here, a variety of companies kind of stood up to the Texas Don't Say Gay law, or that version of it. And they had 65 companies coming in. That's a lot of power. That's a big voice. And so increasingly, this is one way. Now look, trying to get a bunch of competitors to do something together is like herding cats. It's not easy, I get it. But trade associations are understanding this, and they're trying to get and bring value to their members by having a point of view and being that kind of shield, if you will. Companies can get behind that point of view without having to stick their neck out too far. Again, won't solve it, may mitigate it. Please, please, please develop some type of playbook. It could be a one-pager. It could be, for one client, it's a 20-pager. Some type of playbook. There is a direct link as we went back and looked at different companies and how they did in a crisis around social causes and did they do well, kind of okay, or not so good. It really came down to were they prepared? Did they have some kind of playbook that identified and prioritized issues before they were really issues? A suite of messages. My favorite, who does what? Is your CSR team leading this? Your comms team? Your crisis agency? Who's in charge? Who's got the ball? This is where we strangely see a lot of companies kind of fall down. CEO wants to be in charge. What we do make clear is the CSR team has to be at that table. You have expertise on the issues. You know the stakeholders. And then you're going to prep your stakeholders, not just your leaders and your board members, but your employees. Storm clouds are coming. These are the kind of messages we would like for you to push out. Back to those BRGs and ERGs. Back to your thought leadership, those relationships you're building. Back to your nonprofit partners, your community leaders. These are folks that can come to your aid in the time of need. So having that playbook, toolkit, whatever you want to call it, it's essentially break in case of emergency. It's sitting there, and when something comes up, you're good. This enables you to be far more proactive in that moment. What worries me a lot is companies making decisions in the moment with that emotionality. Even when they say they're not, they are. This enables you to dial that down a bit because you've made decisions ahead of time. Then you have to have the discipline to stick to those decisions. This is coming. Now, I said that 2 years ago, and I haven't seen it come as much. But we are seeing media, influencers, and increasingly now employees tracking a company's political donations. And is there a disconnect between those political donations and your CSR? AT&T, State Farm, FedEx, Amazon, Comcast, they're generally very, very good around CSR. They do some amazing stuff, hand out a lot of money, drive some innovative programs. That all goes for crap when this shows up. There was an article today talking about January 6th. Following that, companies said we were going to stop doing this. And guess what? They start working it back. Toyota got called out for that. Came out January 7th, said we're stopping all this. And quietly started donating back to those very same lawmakers they said 4, 5, 6 months ago they said they wouldn't do work with. And they got called out by employees. They didn't walk out of the building like the Wayfair folks did. But it does cause a reputational issue within the company. And when you're trying to hire and most importantly, retain the best and the best talent, these millennials and Gen Zs, who are generally those folks, they're paying attention to this stuff increasingly. Media is paying attention to this. So please do yourself a favor. Understand what your government relations team is doing strategy-wise. I'm sure there are good reasons why they're donating to these lawmakers. The problem is there's a clear disconnect. Coca-Cola talking about LGBTQ and how it's important to them and aligns with their corporate values. And they find out they've been donating to not just 1 or 2, but 20, 30 lawmakers who are directly opposed to this and working to undermine it. Not a good conversation you're having at Coke. So again, I don't want you to be a cautionary tale here, but pay attention to this because it will be coming. More and more consumers are starting to follow the money. All right, gang. Let's remember what we need to do. We need to get the right people in the room to have that internal conversation. Please do it before there's a crisis. Use those 4 questions as a framework to say, and again, you may not all agree, but this is the framework. Are these issues important to us, business-wise, stakeholder-wise, credibility-wise? Do we have the credibility to do it, and can we actually do something? Then you got to choose your favorites in terms of priority and supporting, and then some issues that you're not just simply going to talk about. Develop that plan, and then take 1 or 2 of those ideas we threw out in terms of what we've seen work in terms of mitigating risk internally and externally, and think about those tools I laid out and say, is any of these that we could use to help mitigate risk? This is hard. It's emotional, even when we try to take out the emotion. It's high risk. It's high reward. There's not a ton of data. The best data you can get is generally from consumers and employees who have their point of view, and that's even not the best data. So it's scary, I get it. Asking those 4 questions, prioritizing, figuring out how you're going to have impact, and then different ways you can mitigate are what we've seen work best, what we've seen turn a potential disaster into something that is at least a non-issue. Okay? All right, gang, let's take some questions because I know this generally brings up a lot of thoughts and consternation for some folks. Please.
Because I think sometimes it's helpful to hear things that are positive or companies that are doing this well. So I'd love to point to a statement that Delta Dental of Colorado released in June 2020, outlining their equity timeline and how they were planning to make change. They've continued to release updates on that. And I just think it's great to point to one of our own who is really committed to the hard work that you're talking about. The second is, I appreciate these 4 questions. I do agree with you that this is much harder. There is another really helpful resource that was published by the Harvard Business Review in 2020. That's an issue framework to help you make public statements. I think it gives you a really practical way to walk through it. But just offering 2 additional thoughts to add on to what you've added here.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. Harvard Business, it's literally like a flow chart. If yes, then this. If no, then this. It was hard to put on a PowerPoint without driving you a little dizzy. Oh, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Alex Monster. Right now, we know that our country is divided. When employees take a step to support an issue, how as a company you help to bring everybody together because you have those against, and it creates more division even in your own organization. But we already have it in the outside, right? Even in our families. So how we create that, for lack of better word, harmony in our business, because we're spending most of the time there when I know my coworker is completely against of the issues that I'm passionate about.
I wish I had a magic wand or some way of pointing that out. We do know getting folks in the room versus, everyone's a bit courageous on social media. When you get them in a room, we do see a little of that start to melt in terms of that. So we have seen things like lunch and learns, even at the very basic of lunch and learn. Speakers come in from opposing points of view, but not in an incendiary way, but let's have a conversation kind of way. 2 different nonprofits, one has a different point of view than another, and have a mandatory meeting for employees around that. So we've seen a few things like that where you're bringing employees together, trying to inform them. You're not pushing a point of view. What you're saying is, here's what we're seeing out there. Relying on nonprofits or community organizations is one way of doing that. Without trying to create any kind of incendiary point of view, but really have some folks be able to talk about this in a ideally calm, non-emotive way. Other questions, guy? Please.
Any guide on how do we assess whether we're saying too much, too little, or when it's no comment appropriate?
Got it. We try to avoid no comment because that certainly leaves open for interpretation. What are they hiding, unfortunately? Too much, too little. Again, I wish I had a perfect thing. I hate saying it depends. What we do see is if you can stick to the basics of why are we behind this issue, what are we doing about it, and how others can join us in this. If you can hit those 3, we have seen folks start to go into their legacy of why it's important and all that. That helps a little. Anything beyond that, we do start to question, is that necessary? All right, you're all experts in this stuff now. This is all going to be figured out. If you leave with anything, think about how can you do this in a more proactive way versus in the moment. That in that moment is really hard to make a clear decision. The more you can get ahead of this, that is the #1 thing we've seen make or break companies, being a bit hyperbolic, but you understand. Getting ahead of this is the key. All right? And then the last tip, if you guys have questions, give us a holler. We do 30 minutes, we'll talk you off the ledge. No problem, to help figure this out. It is not easy. You're going to see, but here's the thing, you're going to see more and more of it, and it's going to get more complex, and it's going to get harder because we are still becoming, unfortunately, more and more polarized. All right, gang, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rich, so much for the session. I know that I walked away with many actionable items. Just want to share the upcoming sessions. So the second workshop block is the following. So there's causes in common, the intersection of CSR, DEI, and ESG strategies in Cripple Creek Room 2, and leadership in climate action in Cripple Creek Room 1. And then right here in this room, we have nudging the good at work. So you will have 15 minutes, go to the restroom, chat with each other, and we can't wait to see you soon.